مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الحقيقة كما يقولون أغرب من الخيال. وأول 3 أسابيع لإدارة ترامب والتي شملت أزمات دستورية حول سلطة الرئيس في الرقابة على الهجرة، وأزمات شخصية حول بعض ممن اختارهم الرئيس ضمن مجلس الوزراء، وأزمات في السياسة الخارجية مع حلفاء مقربين مثل استراليا ومكسيك، أسفرت عن فصل مستشار الرئيس للأمن القومي لكذبه بشأن محتوى المناقشات التي دارت بينه وبين السفير الروسي. ينطبق عليها هذا المعيار دون شك. هل هذه الواقعة تمثل المصائب الناشئة لإدارة جديدة ما تزال تتعلم طرق العمل في واشنطن؟ هل هي جهود مقصودة لزلزلة أقدام المنتقدين؟ هل هي أمثلة على فريق جديد غير مستعد لمسؤوليات السلطة؟ هل هي مزيج من الثلاثة معا؟ أم أن هذه الواقعة تمثل شيئا آخر؟ لمناقشة الأيام الأولى الاستثنائية لإدارة دونالد جي ترامب، يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة التي تضم خبيرنا السياسيين نورمان أورنستين وستيف كليمنز. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We're sitting here with our panel of political experts to discuss the first month of Donald J. Trump's administration. Gentlemen, welcome. There's so much to talk about. Let's focus on the truly meaningful stuff rather than the entertaining stuff. Let's start with
Can you tell the difference?
Well, let's start with campaign promises that President Trump is actually implementing, which has gotten a lot of people up in arms, including the third branch of government, the judicial branch. So let's talk about immigration and letting people into America. This has been a huge issue from almost the opening days of the administration. What happened? What did the president actually do? Why is it so provocative?
So we know that to try and get moving quickly, the president did a whole series of executive orders, took executive action. We also know that the normal process that's followed and has been followed by every White House, if you're going to do an executive action, you run it by the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel to make sure you're not running afoul of any laws or the Constitution. You run it by the relevant cabinet departments. And in this case, they did not run it by the Department of Homeland Security and its new cabinet officer, General Kelly, or the Justice Department. It was sloppily put together. It singled out 7 countries, which they said were the 7 countries that harbored terrorists most, and tried to suggest that it had nothing to do with religion, but also tilted towards Christians who come from those countries, which meant it tilted against other religions. And we know that because they did not roll this out smoothly, there was chaos at airports. There were people with green cards who had legal status, others who had been heroes for the United States working with us in Iraq who were turned away, families torn apart. And through that chaos, we had lawsuits, and judges in several cases slapped down the administration, and now they're trying to figure out a plan B. But it was an embarrassment for them, except for the people closest to Trump in terms of his supporters, who love the idea of blocking any of these people from coming into the country.
So let me just ask devil's advocate,
Right.
Steve.
Right.
President wants to prevent bad people coming into the United States. They're not coming from 200 countries. He identified the worst, and in a very temporary way, 2 months, 3 months.
I take your devil's advocate point,
What's
but
wrong
then
with
he would
this?
have blocked people coming from other countries where we actually have seen terrorists come from, like Saudi Arabia and some other countries in the region. That they have, pointed the fact that the 7 nations that Norm just outlined, not a single terrorist incident has been tracked to any individual that has come into the United States and has gone through the vetting process that's come from Syria, come from Sudan, come from any of these countries. So if you were trying to do that, you would have selected different countries. On the broad notion of symbolically trying to tell American citizens, look, I'm trying to address these security concerns and how to do them, then you would have done it in the way that Norm said. But it wasn't just that they didn't show them. It wasn't just an accident that they didn't show them. I was able to report on the story that I talked to senior Office of Management and Budget people. This is part of the White House operation, whose job is to look at the immediate staffing and budgeting dimensions of everything the president does and to sort of actuate, to bring to life any of these executive orders. And they were ordered not to begin the process of working with the other agencies and departments that Norm had said. So this was done on purpose, and it was done to shock the system. And in so doing, you end up sending a signal, even though technically this was not a Muslim ban. It feels like a Muslim ban. It plays like a Muslim ban out in social media. And that sends a signal to our allies working with us inside Iraq, the people our special forces are operating and working with inside Syria, the folks that we're trying to basically inside Iran who've been going back and forth, who are good people who are trying to sort of moderate where Iran is going. It tells all those people, we don't value you, we don't want you anymore. And it puts American lives at risk in that sense. So it had an ironic impact of actually raising the risks to many Americans and American interests abroad. And I think that is the bottom line here, is that, you know, the Trump administration, I'll add one more thing to what Norm said, is and it's very important, is that when we saw people just go to airports and protest all over the United States and even in London, and we saw feminists and we saw gays and we saw folks that had Arab and Islamic friends protesting these things, people were cheering this inside the White House, because for them, this is evidence to their supporters that they're breaking China, that they are disrupting things so much and making liberals crazy. And so while many people were looking at the protests in the airport as this is a sign of Trump's failure, Trump's closest supporters were looking at those protests as a sign of their success.
You know, there's a broader point to make here, too. The two people responsible for this executive order and for many of the other actions were Steve Bannon, the chief strategist inside the White House, and Stephen Miller, a 31-year-old ultra-conservative activist who is a policy director. Bannon's idea is to throw a grenade into the normal workings of government and into all of our relations around the world. It is a shock and awe strategy. And from Trump's perspective, and it appears from what everybody has said, Trump never read the executive order, he just signed what was put in front of him, that Bannon's larger approach, and that fits with one of the things that Trump wants. And remember, we're dealing with an administration where the top people have no experience in government before. They are not aiming to broaden their base of support. They're very happy if they can keep that 35% or so of people who are thrilled to death if you just take on the entire establishment, and they believe that Trump's larger promise was, I'm going to blow up Washington as you know it, and that's what they're doing.
So the next step in all this is that we can expect a revised executive order to knock the rug out from underneath the judicial complaints, I understand. Will that pacify people, or will that just trigger another round of protests?
There's one question here about whether they can basically break apart this executive order into different pieces and they can come up with something that stands legal tests and implement that executive order. The net effect politically and morally for the United States, given the place that this country has, and part of our myth about how we see ourselves, is that we're a home and place for people that are refugees from terror and violence and horrific problems around the world. That's what our Statue of Liberty is supposed to be about, welcoming people from around the world. And this is going and attacking part of one of that core myths of what America is very much about. No matter if they come up with a way to make this executive order legally stand, it still sends a signal to many others of the world that you're not welcome, that we don't like a certain class of people, and that is very hard to undo at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you think we're on to the next crisis, or do you think this crisis is going to stay with us for a while?
We have many crises, and we have a tsunami of crises. Along with this one, and this will continue to work through the courts. And remember, one part of this was Donald Trump didn't just criticize the actions of the courts. He criticized the judiciary as a separate independent branch of government and the specific judges. Right. He suggested that if there were any terrorist acts in the future, You could blame the judge. This is unprecedented. He's going to war with a lot of people. And remember, we're talking about blocking people from coming in, even as we have another set of policies that are going to create a larger crisis, which is throwing people out. Trump's promise that he would get rid of illegal immigrants.
You're talking about the deportations.
Deportations, which he adjusted to say that he was only going to deal with those who had committed some serious crimes, which is actually what Barack Obama had been doing. But now we're seeing sweeps of illegals, of mothers separated from their families. We had one incident in Texas that was quite shocking of a woman, an illegal immigrant, who'd gone to the courthouse to get a protective order from an abusive partner, and there were 6 agents from the Immigration Service waiting to grab her, arrest her, and throw her out of the country, which means that anybody now seeking support from courts if they're being abused or harassed won't go there anymore. We're seeing a much, much broader assault on Hispanic Americans mostly, along with the one on Muslims coming in. And it's creating a great deal of division and turmoil in the country, and it looks like it may get even worse as he ramps up the deportations.
Steve, in this segment, we only have a few more seconds, then we'll take a break. Trump promised all these things.
Yes.
This should not come as a surprise.
Well,
Is that right?
He promised an awful lot of it. I mean, I think that one of the things that happened is he put out a 2-page, basically, contract with Americans promising the various things that he would do, and most of the kind of professional talking head class didn't believe them. But certainly, one by one, he's been going through and just issuing an order to check off those boxes. And so he's very much doing much of what he said. But in contrast to this issue of, deporting dreamers or deporting people here or trying to say he wouldn't break up families, he said those statements. So that is actually a violation of things that he said he would do with regard to the deportations, and the way he's become much harsher in that. But I think those people who doubted Donald Trump would be the wrecking ball that he is being, and that he would somehow be, that his rough edges would be softened by Washington, D.C. are completely wrong. He is delivering on being a wrecking ball. He is delivering on being one of the most extraordinarily different presidents that is, in my eyes, damaging many of the equities that the country has. But certainly, he is delivering on what he said he would do.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to turn from promises kept to unexpected crises, such as the forced resignation of our national security advisor, in just a moment. Let me start this segment with you, Steve. Michael Flynn, who was he, and why is he no longer the national security advisor to President Trump?
Michael Flynn was a former director of Defense Intelligence of the United States. He was fired from that position, but he was also considered a hero by many for doing what many consider to be an incredible job in special forces intelligence, tracking down terrorists inside Iraq and other places. He attached himself early on as a national security advisor to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump brought him in to be his national security advisor. He is gone for a number of reasons. One, he had extraordinary close relationship with Russia and various agents from Russia, including a propaganda arm of the Russian government called RT, Russia Today. He was featured and filmed in a clip attending a dinner with Vladimir Putin, sitting next to Vladimir Putin, and being the first to jump up and give him a standing ovation for the Vladimir Putin dinner. But the bottom line is there have been questions about not only Michael Flynn's contacts with Russia during this extraordinary campaign, where Donald Trump was making highly unusual offers and gestures that were very pro-Putin and very pro-Russia, despite the fact that we know Putin kills many of his adversaries. He's killed people in the media, he's killed political rivals, and despite dissecting Ukraine and annexing Crimea, there are a lot of controversies that Trump and his team seem to be overlooking that. Mike Flynn had contacts with the Russian ambassador on December 29th, made 5 phone calls with the Russian ambassador on the day that President Obama expelled various Russian intelligence diplomats that were here in the United States, shut down Russian compounds here in the United States, and imposed sanctions on Russia. And the worry was that Mike Flynn was actually undermining these issues. But the biggest thing is they denied that he was having those conversations. He denied that he was having those conversations to Vice President Mike Pence, who went out in public and said that General Flynn was not doing these things that he was held accountable for. In the process of all of this blur, so we don't know whether he was an agent of President Trump's interest in talking with Russia, or whether Mike Flynn had lied to enough people in the process. But it was stated by the communications director in the White House that Donald Trump no longer trusted Flynn and then fired him for that.
So, Norm, the traditional investigative question, what did the president know? When did he know it? What did the vice president know? When did he know it? And why does this really matter?
So there's a backdrop to all of this, which is that during the campaign and afterward, Donald Trump went after the intelligence community, basically likened them to Nazi Germany at different times, undermined them. And what we're now seeing is a set of intercepts that the intelligence community had with the Russian ambassador and others. And we know that other countries were doing the same thing. That suggested not just in December, but even before the election, Flynn was talking about sanctions with the Russians. We know he lied to the FBI about those conversations, which is a felony, and that Donald Trump, even after he dismissed him, talked about what a fine person he is. Most of us believe that you're not going to have Michael Flynn going off on his own, interfering with policy before an election or before you become a president without direction from the president. And we may, over time, find out about this. The question is, how will this be investigated and who will do the investigations? And what we also know is that in the aftermath of this, President Trump has picked a friend of his and of Steve Bannon's, somebody with no experience in intelligence, a hedge fund operator, to oversee the entire intelligence community, which probably means purging some people. So this set of stories is not going away for a long time, and the intelligence community is going to continue to probably leak information about connections between Donald Trump, the people around him, and Russia, many of which occurred before the election, which might call into question entirely the legitimacy of the election.
Do we expect congressional hearings on this topic?
Well, there are supposed to be hearings in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, the people in charge are trying to avoid hearings at all. They're being loyal to Russia and to the president. So we don't know how far the hearings will go, or whether the Attorney General, who's extremely close to Trump, Jeff Sessions, will recuse himself from this, as the regulations suggest he should. There's one other little twist in this, which is that James Comey, the head of the FBI, knew most of this before the election, sat on it, and did not make any of it public, even as he was regularly talking about Hillary Clinton's emails. So there are serious questions raised about the director of the FBI as well.
I think that just you ask why this matters, and I think, just to be blunt, after talking to a number of U.S. senators, the concern is, was there collusion between Donald Trump's campaign, direct campaign, and the Russians in the hacking campaign and in the disinformation? If there was collusion, everything that Norm just laid out is absolutely right. It raises a fundamental question. People don't want to say that very publicly, but privately, that is the fear that many people in the U.S. government, within the legislative branch of government, have. And that's what they'll be investigating. The question about where it plays, whether it's in the Intelligence Committee or some other committees in the Senate, makes a big difference as well, because intelligence committees, much of what happens there is classified and does not see the light of day in frequent cases, and can be something that, despite an investigation occurring, it can be hidden from the public for a long time. And so there's a debate by various, by both members in both parties and whatnot, about how to do it and how to serve the public and the public's right to know.
So President Trump, in quite a remarkable way, lashed out against all the sorts of critiques and crises that we've been talking about. His targets were in the intelligence community, the media, in a visceral, very personal way. Does he have any merit in his critique, or is this clash going to be the new normal of politics in Washington?
You know, leaks of this sort coming from the intelligence community are unusual and troublesome in a lot of ways. But Donald Trump, remember, during the campaign, said, among other things, I love WikiLeaks. I love what they're doing. He urged Russia to hack into emails to find Hillary Clinton's emails. He talked about how much leaks were wonderful things.
Right.
So at his press conference, his extraordinary press conference, when he was asked about this, he danced around it and tried to make a distinction between these leaks and the previous ones, and didn't do it very effectively. What we're going to see here in part is whether an intelligence community that sees its own legitimacy attacked and has a lot of its own weapons to deploy. One of the other stories we're hearing is that they are keeping some classified information from the President of the United States because they don't trust him.
Okay, well, gentlemen, I think we have a lot to talk about when we get together our next time. I'm quite sure about that. Thank you for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول أول شهر للرئيس ترامب في البيت الأبيض، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.